Talking to a lot of people, asking, is Louisiana politics different? People out of the state, go, oh, you're from Louisiana, and they're listening for stories and things like that. Has the idea of Louisiana politics been different? I mean, has it become a cliche, or is it really different?
Oh, I think it's really different. I think that, first of all, Southern politics is different than politics elsewhere in the country, generally. And that, I think, is rooted in the fact that the South has been basically a one-party state, so that politicians tended to get elected and stay there for a very, very long time. If you look at the list of Southern senators and Southern House members that have served, you would see historically that once in office, they very rarely ever were defeated, so they ended up staying 20, 30, 40 years in the same position. So it's different generally from the rest of the country, as the South is different. But I think, secondly, Louisiana came into the nation a little bit differently. We were a French state. You can't certainly discount that. And then if you look at the topography, that makes us a little bit different.
How so?
Well, I just think if you take a look at the fact that we're a coastal state, we're very deep into fishing and trapping and outdoors. While that's not unique in the United States, when you couple that with other things, it again separates Louisiana from a vast majority of the states. And again, we're very, very old in comparison to most of the states in America. You might say, well, we came into the nation, later than many, but that doesn't begin to talk to our roots. So our roots were here very early, way back in 1719. All of that makes us different. On top of that, if you superimpose a very poor state, which at one time found a dominant figure like Huey Long, then you began to bring it up to modern times with people who basically followed in that same pattern. Not simply being populist, but being populist and also being fairly charismatic, very dramatic, outspoken, and we've developed any number of those.
Do people come to expect that in their politicians?
I think in Louisiana, yes. I think part of the problem that Governor Treen had was that there was no electricity there. There was no excitement. A very decent, very solid individual, but no pizzazz, no real excitement. And so when he ran for re-election, the state, even though they had elected him and there was no scandal that anyone could really point to, they longed for a kind of entertainment in their politics. I don't mean to say that they went purely for entertainment, but they wanted something more than simple good government. And unfortunately, that has been part of what has driven many Louisiana politicians.
Maybe going over similar ground, but there are other colorful Southern politicians, the Pitchfork, Ben Tillmans of South Carolina, and there's a host of other ones. But it just seems that when you go to the most colorful politicians, even on a local level today, going through all those signs, the nicknames and everything, yeah, Louisiana just stands out. Why is it more colorful here?
I can't say any more about that, I think, than I've already said. Historically, New Orleans was such a dominant city at a period of time in this country when many of the cities which you think of didn't exist. If you take a
and he goes, I guess that's the way they do politics in New Orleans. Is the politics here that different?
Well, I think there are other areas that are also colorful. For instance, Boston has had a colorful political history. You won't find that same kind of history, for instance, in San Jose or in Phoenix. You won't find it in Dallas or in Houston. Those are new cities. They're cities that basically have great economic drives. They had very few ethnic problems, not that they aren't developing those, but if you take a look at the history of New Orleans and see that it was founded way back in 1719, and the racial mix, the ethnic mix that exists in this city, it being a port town and attracting visitors and foreigners and others who were seeking great wealth, because New Orleans was a very wealthy city. I think you come away with a history of being a colorful city and a very different city. It doesn't mean to say that we're entirely unique. There are some areas, for instance, in Chicago has a great political history. But normally you find that it's an older city, one that has great ethnicity, normally a port city, as Baltimore was, and then one that usually is pitted against the rest of the state, and that in itself is not unique. So if you look at it as not any one thing, but a whole combination of things converging, that I think makes New Orleans an interesting political place. And because New Orleans is here, it also makes Louisiana uniquely interesting. I don't think many other states have quite the division that we have. You always have in New York, for instance, the upstate New York, and Illinois, downstate Illinois, however you choose to describe it. But if you drew a line in Louisiana across Alexandria, I mean, you would seem to think that southern Louisiana would have a great deal more in common with southern Mississippi than southern Louisiana has in common with northern Louisiana. Now, that traditionally has been so. I think those kind of lines are being blurred, but southern Louisiana has generally been looked upon as being more liberal, kind of Catholic. If you take in all the Cajun country, kind of French influenced. The northern portion above Louisiana has been Protestant, more rigorous. And then you couple that with the rural parts of Louisiana, which are all over. You've got a very, very, very different mix.
We were driving around Acadiana yesterday, and just for all of us, and all of us have done political coverage before, we have never seen the amount of political signs.
Yeah.
You know, I've been covering politics in New Orleans for 6 years. Yeah, they think a good turnout in Seattle for an election is 30%. I mean, signs, turnout, people talking. What is it about politics that gets people so wrapped up here?
I've never really been able to figure that out for myself. We spend more money on elections here than any place else in the country. Now, that is per capita, not in gross amounts. When I was elected mayor in 1970, I spent, I think, $500,000 in the first primary and ended up spending another $2, so I was spending about $700,000. And I had spent, of the major candidates, I was the fourth biggest spender because Jimmy Fitz and Billy Gus and Dave Gertler all spent more money than that. I luckily ended up getting in the second primary and then winning, but the point that I'm making is even with that amount of money, I was still the fourth, just the fourth largest spender. That same year, or a year later, Mayor Wise of Dallas was elected, and he spent $17,000 to get elected. We just have an intense interest in politics. We have the oil and gas industry, I think, here and has fueled a lot of that. But I don't think you can ascribe it all to simply the availability of political money. I think the governor's office here has been very, very powerful, and the mayor's office in New Orleans has been very powerful. If you go to cities where a mayor is more of a figurehead, that the power is with a city manager, as you have in many of the cities west of the Mississippi, and some east, but mostly west of the Mississippi. The mayor performs a function, but it's not the powerful function that you'll find in a Louisiana mayor, such as New Orleans or in Baton Rouge. You find the same thing, frankly, in Chicago or in Boston, where you have very strong chief executives. I don't mean the personality is strong, but the government vests a great deal of power in that individual. So naturally, they have the power to do good and the power to do bad. They have the power to bless with patronage or the power to take away. and that basically makes people a player. Bear in mind, it's not just politics that we're into. We're into other things too that people elsewhere aren't. And the amount of energy and time that we put into Mardi Gras, for instance, we tend to eat out more than most people in America do. We party more than most people in America do. There's a joyfulness in this state, sometimes a sadness, but generally a joyfulness about what we do, and politics is part of that joy.
On election,
hold on just a second. I'm getting a little rubbing here. I'm gonna.
lines of people getting involved in politics. Every campaign we talk about has been telling us, sort of in the side, going, don't look at us in the polls now because we're gonna have the money on the streets on election day. The whole mobilization thing. How do people mobilize on election day, money and otherwise?
I think a great deal of that is exaggerated. Of course, I must confess that I'm not familiar with rural election day politics. I've been involved with it peripherally, but never directly, so I can't really comment. In the city itself, I think that's highly exaggerated. There was a time when within the city we were organized on a ward and precinct and block basis. That hasn't been so for the last 30 years. So I think that's highly exaggerated. I think people are far more independent today. I don't mean to say that they aren't influenced, but obviously the educational level is a lot higher. We have better transportation systems. And we have public television. I don't mean public as your station, but you've got television now that's available to everybody, so that people being able to read newspapers, look at television, radio, they're making up their own minds, and they have no problem getting to the polls. I'm sure that in the rural areas there's still some problems where a person with proper organization can do fairly well. But I'm inclined to think that most of that is pretty exaggerated.
You've served in the state legislature. You're mayor of the biggest city in the state. You're in national governments. You've got a lot of experience, not only in terms of levels of government, but also historically.
Yeah.
We're interested in a couple of things. How Louisiana politics has changed, since you first got into politics. Were you first elected under Jimmy Davis or under Earl
Yes,
Warren?
Jimmy Davis.
Okay, and also to describe some of the most powerful political figures in Louisiana, like the governors. So how's politics changed?
Well, the biggest change in Louisiana politics, obviously, is the change that has come about in our racial attitudes. Up until in the mid-60s, I guess, virtually every politician was told the minute you thought of getting into it that, son, two things you got to do is you got to be against taxes and you got to be for segregation. I frankly, and I look back on it with some pride, resisted both of those in 1960, going against the advice of older, well-intentioned people. I refused to put either one of those things on my campaign card, and it didn't mean that people felt that way. It's just that something they advised you had to do, son, if you ever hope to have a future in this business. Of course, as the Civil Rights Act passed and the Voting Rights Act ultimately passed at the national level, that began to change as blacks began to get voting power, so that people, I don't know of anyone that would dare put that on campaign literature today. I'm not saying that racism doesn't apply in some selective instances here, but by and large, that by far is the greatest change that has taken place. I think there's also a general realization that government isn't free, that you have to pay for it. Now, nobody wants to be the one that pays for it, but at one time the concept of the populist concept of that somehow or another all these services were manufactured out of the air is not widely held today. And the argument is, okay, we now know that we have to pay for it. This question is who is going to pay and how are we going to frame this. So I think those are the two biggest changes that I've seen. And of course, television has made an enormous difference in how people campaign. You can't very well say one thing in one part of the state today and something different in another. There's a recorded testimony of what you're doing.
Did people try to do that in past campaigns?
Oh, why, certainly, sure.
What sorts of stuff?
Well, whether you play in one area of the state against the other, blacks against whites, and there's still some of that takes place, but far less, I think, than you saw in the past.
Do you know Edwin Edwards fairly well, or you're obviously
Yes, I know Governor, not very personally, in a personal way. I know him politically quite well. Yeah.
Describe him politically. Why has he been as dominant a figure in the state?
Well, first of all, he's an extremely bright individual. He's very articulate, very decisive. He's got wonderful qualities of recall, and he's just about as bright a fella as I have ever met in the business. That doesn't mean he's just a bright politician. He is a bright, intelligent, smart, decisive person. And all of those on the positive side. On the negative side, if it is in fact a negative, and as I don't know that he ever developed a real philosophy about who he was and what it was that he wanted to accomplish. He had 2 great terms as governor. Obviously, these last 2 have not lived up to everyone's expectation, and certainly not up to his expectation. And then people change, you know. I remember Governor Edwards going into office and wanting to be the most open governor ever. I had a discussion with him about it. He felt that somehow or another he could just speak openly and honestly to the press about every issue and be totally available to them. And as a matter of fact, I think he won a national award, as I recall, press award, for being one of the most open governors and accessible to the press. And it wasn't but a year after that thing began to turn sour. The press is just absolutely insatiable. It doesn't mean that the press isn't trying to do a good job, it just means that it's insatiable. The very nature of it is that if you opened this much to the press, then you have to open that much, and then that much. There is never an end. The press can never draw a limit on what they want available. If they're permitted to come into meetings, and I'm not advocating that they're not, I'm simply saying then they want to be in the bathroom with you. Then they want to be there when you're on the operating table. I mean, and they want to be in the bedroom, and there's no limit to what they won't ask. So I think there was certain disenchantment that set in also with that.
Of course, at the same time, the governor is, he's had some of the most amazing quotes of any public official I've ever seen.
Well, that is correct. He is very open, very frank. I think he for a long time had his finger on the pulse of the public. He understood that what the people don't like is hypocrisy. They can accept certain failings if we're honest about them and up front, if we are who we say we are. I think ultimately he believes that perhaps he has gone too far sometimes in what he has said, because that ultimately comes back to haunt you when it's done in excess. And ultimately that image gets painted, and as long as things are going well, the public's inclined to accept that and say, well, the guy's unique, and I'm not referring to Edwin now, the Governor Edwards himself only, but they're inclined with anyone to say, well, the fellow's outspoken, he's unique, and as long as things are going well, that's all right. But when things turn sour economically, or there are some personal problems that arise, then that thing sometimes comes back to bite you. And I think he's facing a lot of that right now. Some of it very unfairly, to be honest with you, but also I think, much of it is self-induced.
Is it strange to see him poised at what seems to be a defeat? I mean, a man who's always towered above politics?
No, I think every one of us faces that. We're sitting here before the election. I mean, you can't stay forever. Ronald Reagan went into office with such an incredible mandate just 3 years ago, and today he's I'm fairly convinced that he couldn't get reelected again, even though there's still some store of goodwill out there. Nobody can stay in this business forever. What many people fail to realize is that the exposure, the constant exposure, sooner or later, no matter how good you are, eventually turns. If you take a look at the average television show, if Dallas stays on the air and it stays on the air for 3 years, that's a pretty good run. The Honeymoon is as famous as it was. I think stayed for maybe a year, 12 months, 18 months. I'm no expert, but that's my recollection. How long can you stay on top with that kind of exposure? The problems that arise sometimes are beyond your ability. We benefit from our good fortune and we suffer from the bad fortune, and much of it is beyond our control.
Governor's mansion
Yeah.
for you. I mean, pretty serious.
I mean, we're not sitting there being inspired, but boy, we're sitting there going, wow, this is a speech. I mean, because the energy's flowing. You know, he says, I did this, you know, do you remember that I did this? And the crowd screams, you did. It's like more like being at a revival meeting.
Yeah, he's an able guy.
What areas have we not gone into that you guys are thinking about?
That's, basically covered a lot of stuff. There seems to be a belief among, we've talked to a number of people who are obviously supporting other candidates. It's general voters.
Yeah.
And they say one of the reasons that Edwards has such big support at this stage in the game is because the education level in the state is so low, and he has a lot of fairly uneducated and undereducated people supporting him. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I haven't seen anything to indicate that. I think that Edwin has, the governor has a fairly broad-based black support. And he deserves a great deal of that support. I don't know of any governor that has, as a practical matter, done more for the black people of this state than is Edwin Edwards. I mean, there are people who question why he did it. There's some who argue, well, he doesn't really have a great feel of sensitivity, and as you've seen, some of the campaign literature saying when he was in Congress he voted against this and voted against that and voted against this, trying to say, well, philosophically, he's not really, your friend. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at the appropriations, when you look at the appointments of department heads, boards and commissions, there isn't any question that he opened the floodgates to at least some equal opportunity in a state political system that had heretofore been closed. Now, he was not the first. Governor McKithen made some strides in that direction, but nothing comparable to what Governor Edwin was able to do. Now, in all fairness, he was serving, didn't start serving until the 70s, so we had already had all the civil rights legislation passed and the Voting Rights Act, and blacks were becoming far more of a force in state politics than they had been before. But, we can make all kind of reasons why things were done or why they weren't done. The fact of the matter is that he's developed some great allegiances and loyalties out there.
A lot of folks have compared him on the state level to your administration here in New Orleans, so that there's a rational reason why the support is there, and that people don't complain about it or just complain about it because they wish they had it.
Well, I suppose so. I would, without making any comparisons, my dedication to the issue started way back when I was in the state legislature and all through my councilmanic days. So I had a much longer history of involvement, and it didn't happen just when I became mayor. That happened to give me the opportunity to do some things that I knew had to get done and should have been done a long time ago. And I came into office in the Wakeham administration that was not a mean administration, but simply hadn't moved anywhere on the racial front, so that it was a very dramatic change. Governor Edwards, on the other hand, came in after Governor McKithen. Governor McKithen had made some steps. For instance, he had appointed the first black judge. In the Dome Stadium, we had done some economic development work for the black community, although it became very controversial. So he had broken a number of barriers, and it just so happened that Governor Edwards built on that, and he built on it very dramatically, so that there is a good feeling, I think, among much of the black leadership. I think he probably is going to feel that he's entitled to more of the black vote than he's going to end up getting in this election. But the very nature of it is that once people begin to have some political power, there are some who are in and some who are out. And so those who have not been, close to the head of the table, find it to their interest to find a candidate who do just as well, they hope, racially, but at whose table they will sit closer to the head.
One last thought that I've got. We're talking about Edwin invoking the Huey Long image and everything. But Louisiana, some people think Louisiana is changing. In 1987, invoking Huey Long, stirs up a lot of passions. But is it to the point that maybe Edwin has not only overstayed himself politically, but also overstayed himself historically? Is Louisiana not really,
Well, that's a hard thing to say on the eve of the election, because the polls are so confusing right now that even the pollsters can't pick it. You kind of play in politics, some people argue that you play the hand that's dealt you, and he may have no other hand to play. The newspapers around the state have been universally opposed to him, and they have savaged him now over a period of years. The good government, in quote, good government types have likewise savaged him. I don't say that with saying they're right or wrong. That's just where they've been. And if he's going to get elected, maybe the only card he has to play to those who would identify with him politically. And that identification has been, as he has made it part of his platform, with a kind of openness, an open lifestyle, gambling, playing to the poor and the underprivileged. So that's the card he's got to play. I don't think he could be successful in an election if he ran on an absolute straight-up, reform platform. There are other candidates who have claimed that field, and that doesn't mean they're any better, any worse. They've claimed that territory. So they've taken the high ground. And he's got to go on what he effectively did. How do you run for re-election saying so much about what you're going to do when you're there having to defend what you've done? So you've pretty well got to run on what you have accomplished when you're running for re-election. You can hold out a certain vision and certain hope for the future, but you're also stuck with having to defend and to run on your record.
Thank you very much. That was great.